Um, so, where was I? Beautiful necklace? Yeah. Um, it's absolutely a beautiful necklace and it's paradise. What we do have, despite the fact that we don't have those hills and rivers, what we do have is a really, really beautiful, loads, thousands of coral gardens. And the coral gardens are rich in colors and biodiversity, and they are our source of food. And also, they are our security blanket from ocean waves that come from far. We're very fragile. I'm sure you've all heard the tourism, Maldives is paradise, and it truly is. I grew up eating catch of the day, literally the catch of the day, 4 times or 3 times a day. We had enough groundwater to use for our cooking, cleaning, essential household things. And we collected rainwater for drinking. And we had enough space in our homes to collect the rainwater, and it was a real family community affair when rain starts. I remember when I was very young, in the middle of the night, after a period of waiting for the monsoon rain, I woke up because my parents and grandparents were knocking on the boys' doors and saying, can you all come out in the middle of the night, or in the middle of the morning rather in English, to collect water because the rainwater's coming. We were really happy. Sea was our playground. I taught my little brother colors and how to count in both in English and in our language, just looking at the sea from the jetty. But one thing that, the story I want to say is, when I was very young, in this beauty of this peaceful place, we start hearing that the fresh water is getting salty. So because it started getting salty, we first started doing a rainwater rinse after our laundry, because we don't want our laundry to be salty. And then eventually this rinse was extended to our dishes and our cleaning rituals. And then suddenly we don't have enough rainwater for drinking, and we start sharing the rainwater within the neighborhoods and things like that. As a kid, I was so fascinated and really worried. How does water turn into salt water? I couldn't quite comprehend at that age. So I remember stealing a glass from the kitchen, because I wasn't supposed to take things out of the kitchen, and leaving a glass of water under my bed, trying and tasting it every day to see whether it turned salty. So I kept asking, why is this happening? And then everybody's starting to telling me that's because the sea level is rising. And then I will look at the beach and I'll be like, is it rising? I can't quite understand. In all of that chaos, at some point, because I was very young, I remember government introduced a service where you can call a number and they will deliver water. And so in preparation for this service to be used, we have to buy it. Household budgets need to be adapted. Okay, that meant household budget is taking a huge hit, because we now have to pay for water, and we have to build containers to be able to to be able to store this water. So the government vans will come, and they have this big hose and a pump, and they will pump. And it was so fascinating as a kid to look at water being pumped. I've never seen a waterfall by then, just to let you know. I've never seen one. And it was a sight. Part as a kid, it was festive because there was commotion to it. But at the same time, I also remember my parents really sitting on the bed and speaking about how much the water cost, and that we really need to conserve water. We were still using groundwater by this time just to do sort of, toilet flushing, sort of, cleaning that wasn't going to touch our food and clothing and our beds and things like that. But eventually I remember the conversation was, how is the water in your area? Are you able to use it for flushing toilets? In my area, we can't, because it stinks so badly. And to the point that I remember, I couldn't tell the difference between the garbage and the water in our flush tanks. And the color started changing, and it was really smelly, and to the point that nobody on our island now use water to even flush toilets. As I grew up and as my education improved, and as I started learning about environment and climate, by this time I've realized, okay, sea level rise is the issue here. But is it really just the sea level rise that's causing such a significant issue on my island? And then I soon learned that in the rest of the country, where there is a larger number of people living, this is an issue. Not as big as on my island, because my island is the capital. And I grew up on compound living, but now we all live in tiny apartments, which is built into 6 stories or 10 stories. And you don't get daylight even on the 6th floor in most of these apartments. And we don't eat catch of the day anymore. What do we eat? Processed meat and frozen fish imported. Why? Because our own fish is far more important than these products. Catch of the day is a luxury now for us. So we don't have fresh water, we don't have food security, we don't have financial security, because we are literally paying for desalinated water on every single island, a plant. Because on a necklace of islands, a garland, you can't just build bridges. You can't just transport water. We have an issue with plastic because we have to depend on bottled water, imported bottled water, and locally produced bottled water. Our islands are really tiny. So this got me thinking, what is the real impact of climate change? Is it really just biodiversity loss that I know just through my own eyes and observation, by the 70% loss of the coral gardens for us? Yes, it definitely is. But it has a much stronger impact, and you see it throughout years. You don't see it instantly. We know about the sudden weather-related disasters, but we don't often talk about the slow onset climate change impact on communities, on economies, and on health, and on our psychology, and on our security. So that's my story. So I obviously became really, really passionate about climate change. And eventually, somehow, I ended up in UK and working for a climate charity that's working to create social and political mandate for change. I love this. So we do social science research, we try to engage with people, we try to bring people with us. What I've learned is that people care about climate. People want political leadership. People want to make change happen. People want to be fair. But what to do, how to do, is still a question. So I started coming to places like COP with a lot of hope, and really proud as a Maldivian, because we're not just the vulnerable people, we are also the climate leaders, because we were predicted to disappear by 2020. But I'm here, we are here as a nation. But what I've learned over the years coming to COP is we come to these big spaces, political leaders make big, bold promises and pledges. Trust me, I've spoken to them. I really feel their sincerity and genuineness in wanting to make and change happen. But when they go back to UK, I'm also going back to UK, or when they go back to their countries, I'm also going back to Europe and Western countries. But the conversation and the mood around elections and around the political system is completely different to the energy we sometimes see here. So I got really passionate about what is this disconnect? Why are we stuck in a cycle where we make so many promises and we ask our leaders from global north countries and around the world, richer countries, to make these promises for countries and communities like mine? We get those, but those promises are not honored because politicians feel like they don't have a political and social mandate, whereas we feel like there is no political leadership. So I started really, really thinking about this, and this is where I really started getting involved with some of the work Isbay Foundation has been doing on political systems thinking. So I'm going to stop here for now and hand over to Rich to tell you a little bit more about the work he's doing in this moment. And I think it's really poignant to have this conversation in the context of what's recently been happening in this landscape. And thank you all for hearing me and listening to me.
Thanks, Noora. Oh yeah, brilliant. So, can I have the slides up, please? So, we are at a moment of political jeopardy. There's just no denying it. And what we're noticing, though, around the world is that there is a global movement of people building a new politics, and very often it's about water. It's about flooding, it's about clean water, it's about agriculture, it's about food. And we're even noting that water as a key to a conversation that can bring people together is proving often more helpful than things like carbon or climate, etc. Who could argue with the fact that we all need to have clean water to drink? Who would argue with the fact that our rivers and beaches should be clean? Who would argue with that? Anyone? And yet, even in a country like mine in the UK, our rivers are not clean. You know, our seas are far, far, far from clean. And so we're at this pivot point in politics. But we've been here, clicker? Yeah, but we've been here before. To get universal suffrage in the UK and the US took 100 years to achieve that goal. It was a long time. There's never been an extension of suffrage and power without civil disobedience, without people going to jail, and according to my colleague Farzan at Oxford University, without anyone actually dying. This is what it takes to change our politics. This is what it takes to kind of give people power, which tends to lead to addressing the issues we face. There's a key quote by this lady that Aron Sen, that in order to protect, the purpose of politics has to be to create a healthy planet. And it's a reframing of the John Stuart Mill quote, which I'm not sure she was even aware of, was that, you know, the purpose of government has to be to keep you safe. If you're not able to keep people safe, if you're not able to keep a healthy planet, you lose your legitimacy for governance. And those of us who may be on the left of the debate, like myself, I'm a progressive, we have lost lots of these arguments. We have failed to be able to give people the jobs they want to have. We have failed to be able to address the climate crisis. We really need to realize that unless we can do this, we can't build the politics kind of we need. Next slide, please. And there's a brilliant American movement theorist called Bill Moyer. Anyone here heard of Bill Moyer? If you haven't heard of Bill Moyer, I strongly recommend you check out his movement map online. If you just put Bill Moyer movement map right now into Google, you'll get it up there. And what he shows he looks at movements around the world of cigarettes, nuclear, abortion, many of the major social movements, and the relationship between public awareness and kind of and movement alternatives. And what he found was, so once you get to very high levels of public awareness, so in the world right now, we have often over 90% commitment to action on climate. We've got over 90% commitment in most countries to major political systems change. But what we don't have is an agreement on the alternatives. Should it be citizens' assemblies? Should it be people-powered politicians? We don't know yet. And I think the task we have over the coming years is to work out, how do we create a new politics and a new democracy to be able to work out how things might work. But there are a whole bunch of really interesting activities happening around the world. So one of the key things that's come from our research is you need to see democracy and governance as a system. It's not just about voting. It's not just about political parties. It's about how we live and breathe our lives on a day-to-day basis. This is a Irish schools citizens' assembly. We're hoping that pre-COP30 we get hundreds of thousands of children engaged in COP30 through the Global Citizens' Assembly, operating mainly in schools, and this is an example of that happening in Ireland. Truth is a kind of foundational element of any form of government, whether it's democratic or not. Countries like Brazil, I think, need to be celebrated for their commitment to looking at the way in which social media is eroding and removing truth from our lives. This is just a reality. This is just a situation. I'm not saying what Brazil have done is perfect, but it's much, much better than what other countries have done. And I think you can actually look at, I think China have got a lot to teach us on this. Their regulation of social media, focusing mainly on the protection of young people, is much, much stronger than you get in my country. They've got much lower mental health issues related to social media in China than you have got in the UK because of their much stronger regulation of that. This is an example of the forest assemblies in India. these ancient ways in which communities come together, recognizing their legitimacy to govern because they've been living there for generations. Often you see people running assemblies, people being not clear whether or not they've got legitimacy. Are we representative of the population? To say thanks to Noora, she has got to rush off to an event. And there's this movement of people's assemblies, of citizens' assemblies around the world that hopefully, for the COP30 Global Citizens Assembly, we're going to kind of provide the mechanisms for them all to plug together so that in Belém, a year from now, we're able to have a new track for the COP, whereby just how 10 years ago, the green zone that we're in was invented as part of the Paris Agreement. As part of the Brazil Agreement, as part of the COP30 COP, there will be a citizens track. But this citizens track is not going to be another red zone or purple zone on the edge of the formal negotiations. It's going to be located in people's communities, in communities like this, where people are already having the conversations about the climate crisis. Because the reality is that we are at a pivot point. We are at a choice between more or less democracy and how we govern the world. But there are millions of people already organizing. There are millions of people coming together inside and outside of formal politics to be able to adapt to the climate crisis. And our job, I think in places like this, is to connect them and actually for us to start recognizing that they are the leaders. We had an announcement yesterday from the UK government of an 81% reduction by was it 2035? But this is unusual, isn't it? And we also know there's a huge gap between commitments and actions. My country's been pretty good at making commitments, and it's been extremely bad at following through on them. However, if you look at people around the world, people now are leading the debate on climate and action across the board. There's been over 300 climate assemblies in the last 5 years. In every single case, they come up with policies that are more ambitious than what the politicians come up with, simply because they're not constrained by the same assumptions, the fossilized institutions, the outdated ideas and compromises inherent in those and often antique institutions. Anyone know who this is? Atanas Mokas, the ex-mayor of Bogota. He is an example I would have of the global movement of people-powered politicians. There's a whole movement of politicians out there who are explicitly putting their community before parties. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. So often when we think about new politics, you might look at activists or citizens' assemblies happening outside of politics. No, there are people leading governments, leading cities, leading countries in some cases around the world who are explicitly doing this. There's a couple of people here, Carla, from Froome, who are leading on this in the UK at a local level. This is the Global Citizens Assembly we ran for COP26. 100 citizens who are a demographic representation of the global population. They're there. It was the first time we'd ever had a Global Citizens Assembly. They had set 68 hours worth of deliberation on the IPCC data, and they presented their findings at COP. But what's going to happen for COP30 is going to go much bigger than this. We're going to have 300 people in the core assembly. We're going to have hopefully 100,000 people minimum operating through the community assemblies. If anyone here would like to run a community assembly, is from an organization who'd like to participate in creating this new institution, it's going to be a permanent institution running parallel to COPs on a permanent basis. So please get in touch with me after this and we can talk about that. Next slide, please. And then I just want to share this, finish off before we have a conversation between ourselves on this example. So I used to work for the IPCC, and then I worked in the UK Parliament as a climate lobbyist. And I always remember during the Iraq War protests, walking out of Parliament, whereby we'd had the best government we could have ever had, wanting to make commitments to the environment, but they just weren't doing it. They were always getting distracted by the news, by people in their constituencies wanting to respond to things like litter or dog mess and this type of thing. And to be honest with you, it felt to me like the system was never going to be able to deliver on the manifesto. And I remember sitting on the streets with the activists, really struck by how many of my friends in Parliament were going to vote through on a war that they knew was wrong. They were imprisoned by the system, and they were being forced to do something they didn't want to do. And then I came across this project, the Boston's Conversations Project. It happened in 1994. John Salvi walked into the Planned Parenthood clinic in Boston, and he shot dead the receptionist. And he went down the road and did it again. Now, normally what happens when these horrific incidents took place in the States is a massive media event would take place. But both the pro-choice and the pro-lifers decided not to do that. And instead what they did is they met in private for months just listening to each other. They didn't want to change their minds. They didn't want to kind of come up with any policies. They just listened to each other. And through that process, what happened was both sides got even clearer that they were right. There was no consensus that took place at all, but a deep respect. Some of them said even love emerged between the people there, which completely changed the debate around abortion in Boston. So there's never been a violent incident since that date in 1994. And the power of these new politics is that. It's not necessarily about agreeing solutions to the climate crisis or agreeing solutions to abortion or anything else. It's about building the deep solidarity and relationship and sometimes even love between those people who fundamentally disagree. Because when we create those conditions of deep respect, then incredible things are possible. And I feel at this moment, in the wake of the recent elections in the States, I've seen myself describe people on the other side as being, fascist, or equating them with, or painting them in ways that just simply isn't true, that simply isn't fair. And the one thing I'm committed to doing from this moment onwards is really just seeking to listen to people with very different perspectives from mine and trying to create the conditions for that respect to emerge. And I think that is really going to be the secret ingredient of how we can create a new politics. And coming back to water seems to be the key. Because who wouldn't agree that we all need to have clean water to drink? Who wouldn't agree that our rivers and oceans should be clean? And if we can agree on that, perhaps we can create the conditions to agree on much, much more. Thank you. So unfortunately, Noora's had to go, but would anyone like to ask any questions? Any hand at all? Yeah, at the back.
Do you think you could have that sort of respectful disagreement with someone like Trump?
I think you can. I don't know if you've hung out much with, people you disagree with. Has anyone got a family member, a family member that, that really makes their blood boil? I don't know. Has anyone got that? It's a good place to practice, right? It's a hard place to practice, and but I think that's our job. Our job is not to agree. Our job is not necessarily to compromise on red lines. Absolutely, if anything, on issues like trust, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever, as any person, politician or otherwise, if you are deliberately fabricating truth, you're undermining truth, that's wrong. And we should never seek to kind of deny that. But I absolutely do think we should seek to be in relationship with one another, whoever they are, even if they need to be locked up,
Thank you. Given your experience lobbying in the UK Parliament, how do you think we move, or how do you make politicians move from consensus, understanding that water is necessary to life and the key, to political will to take action?
Yeah. So I think one of the really important things here is the difference between policy and action. So often political will, there's two dimensions. There's the political will to make the commitment, to make the policy, and then there's the political will to follow through. That is much harder. And I think part of the challenge at the moment I'm noticing is that if we're going to be delivering, you need to have politicians leading who know how to change their own systems of government. So, for example, following the 2016, I became obsessed about how do we build people's agency? How do we build solidarity? It turns out that has anyone heard of the research on self-efficacy by Albert Bandura? If you have, that's brilliant. If you haven't, check it out. It's an extraordinary depth of research. So if you want to support people, for example, to be able to learn to play the piano or to be able to do well at school, you've got to have an education system, right, which builds their self-efficacy. If you look at most global north countries at the moment, they just don't have those systems in place anymore. They've forgotten how to do that. They've forgotten how to do the business of government. So I think one of the real challenges we face in many countries is that there is the political will to grandstand, but there isn't often the political know-how to build the systems of government required to deliver. And so I think there's a very different... I wrote a book 10 years ago called Anti-Hero, which was basically about kind of invisible leadership to kind of get stuff done. And I think those political leaders who aren't so worried about being seen, but are worried about implementing, are the kinds of leaders we probably need. But unfortunately, I'm not sure the system generates them.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. You have mentioned that UK didn't implement some of the promises, fulfill some of the promises. Just very curious, what are they? Could you bring any examples of that? And what do you think about the current commitment to cut 81% of emissions by 2035? Do you think it's feasible to implement? Just your opinion about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely feasible. Absolutely. And fundamentally, so there's been brilliant work done on this by people like E3G and others. If you look at the relationship between kind of policy commitment and action, the big problem in the UK under the previous government was just simply money. So they would make these major commitments, they'd put absolutely no money behind it whatsoever. So that was so I think the capability was there for implementation, but we had a real problem in the UK with the previous government. And I wrote, for example, a part of the civil society strategy. After I wrote the civil society strategy, I went to the government and said, when's the money going to come in? Normally you'd have a conversation whereby they would then allocate money for implementation. In the second meeting, I realized the money was never going to arrive, because that was not how they thought of government. And I think what's interesting to see with the potential Musk going into his role of a government efficiency feels like precisely wrong at this moment in history, because a lot of governments are pretty efficient. What we need often is more government, not less. And so I think that feels like a precisely wrong thinking. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. You mentioned how mutual respect is really important. How would we move forward and progress as a society if all we're doing is respecting each other and not agreeing on an idea and moving forward with it?
Yeah, so brilliant question, but I would say that it's not mutually exclusive. So in my experience, when you're running these processes that generate mutual respect, that then creates the conditions, an atmosphere of respect whereby, so take the Boston's Conversations Project example, then there was a recognition that we did need to protect vulnerable young women in that very precise case, and things were put in place to do that. So my statement is a little bit of a trope, because actually what does happen is once you create the respect, people will be able to listen to a wider conversation. And basically what we're wanting to do here is get away from these arguments of being I'm right, you're wrong, and have a conversation like, how do we have clean air to breathe? How do we have clean water? How can we protect vulnerable people? And those kinds of things most people wouldn't disagree with in terms of the outcome. That's my experience, at least. Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, what is the criteria to measure whether a policy is good, and what's the criteria whether it's good for people or for the climate?
Wow. The criteria for whether a policy is good for people in the climate. So I think, this is a bit of a sideways answer, and it might be inadequate, but we have 5 criteria for measuring whether new political systems are going to work. So first one is can we create institutional impact, which is both policy and implementation. 2 is we look at, does it build citizen action? So galvanize. So one of the things I didn't say in my talk, but I think is really critical, is we need to, who here is familiar with transactional analysis? Kind of parent-child relationship type stuff. Anyone familiar with that at all? If you haven't read the book by Eric Byrne, it's really old, called Games People Play. You can buy it on Amazon for like 50p or something. Do buy it, it's a classic. Basically, you will be familiar with the ideas because it's all about parent-child dynamics. And fundamentally in politics at the moment, we have a situation whereby often politicians think citizens are kind of a bit stupid or reactionary, and citizens sit here and think, our politicians don't care about us, they are corrupt, etc., etc. What we need to do instead is recognize the very real power that both sides have got. And so, for example, on many issues, like whether you're going to find a new job, whether you're going to change your behavior to be able to, to deliver on climate commitments or deliver on healthy eating, citizens have got extraordinary amounts of power. Like, unless you want to live in a very top-down dictatorship, we have to recognize that we've got extraordinary amounts of power. And so what we need to do is create systems of government which recognize that, of course, politicians, doctors, lawyers, civil servants have got huge amounts of power. That's real power. But also we have too as citizens. And so to have new types of government structures which recognize that. Now, that's not the same as the questions you asked at all, but I think my point being is that the thing I'm most interested in is how can we create systems of policy and government which can activate citizens, because they're a key part of the change process. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of a political commitment that doesn't have a associated implementation plan which will involve the activation of citizens to do that. Have we got time for another question, or are we at time? Okay, any more questions? We good? Thanks everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you.